Welcome, everyone. We're excited that you have joined us today. I am Kelly Haran, and I am a member of our programs team here at Guidepost Montessori. Although I'm not currently in the classroom, I still consider myself a Montessori elementary guide for life. I think that will always be part of me. I always like to go over just a few housekeeping items to let you know that we will be recording this webinar. So if you want to revisit it later, you can. It will be posted on the Guidepost Montessori YouTube channel. And you can watch it or share it afterwards. We'll post it within the next day or two. And if you have questions as Lindsay or Rivka is talking, you can put them in the questions tab of the panel. And actually, let's go ahead and get oriented to that. If you haven't used GoToWebinar before, it might take a moment just to find that. And I always like to ask where you're joining us from. And maybe just because of this topic, if you are a parent or an educator and where you're joining us from, that would be great to know. You can find the questions tab. We have an educator from Austin. Welcome. Teacher from Miami. See someone I know from Atlanta. Got New York, South Bend, Indiana, parents from Arlington, Virginia. All right, Canada. Woo! 3 from Canada, actually. Great representation. Well, wonderful. I know people will continue to come in, but I wanted to go ahead and introduce my colleagues today. So first we have Lindsay Journo. She's sort of going to be kicking things off to talk about our distance learning approach. Lindsay has worked in education for the past 2 decades, from infancy all the way through adolescence. In addition to her Montessori training, Lindsay holds Bachelors of Arts and Education degrees from York University in Canada. So I think that was the woo for Canada. Lindsay is also a Montessori mom. She has 2 elementary age children who have been in Montessori since they were toddlers. And Rivka is the head of school at Guidepost Montessori Museum Mile in New York City. And she has founded schools twice over and has also served as a Montessori guide for children ages 3 all the way through high school. And she is passionate about research, experimentation, and innovation to meet a diverse range of learners. So she is perfectly suited to support our pivot to distance learning that we're excited to share with you today. So I think with that, I will turn things over to Lindsay to share more about our approach. And then Rivka is going to do a showcase of altitude. And unfortunately, we were going to have Kacee Weaver, our colleague, share some anecdotes. She's one of our distance learning guides and a member of our programs team, but she's not feeling well today. So Rivka is going to jump in and share some samples and anecdotes from the classroom. Great, Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and welcome everyone. We're so happy that you're here with us. The impetus for this webinar was actually a lot of you reaching out to us, a lot of parents and a lot of teachers and guides who were curious about what does Montessori look like at a distance. Some of you are brand new to Montessori, some of you have been involved with Montessori for years, but we're really curious about what virtual distance learning looks like for Guidepost Montessori. So we're really happy to share. I hope that the information proves helpful to you, whether you are a parent who is at home guiding your own children's education, or whether perhaps you're a guide who is looking for some best practices to bring back to your own virtual classroom. And we'll be sure to leave lots of time at the end for your questions, because I have a feeling there'll be a lot of them. So, thinking back a few months, it feels like a lifetime ago, but a few months ago when COVID first really hit, and we at Guidepost had the realization that we were going to need to close our brick and mortar classrooms and make that transfer to distance learning, we really did some soul searching about what would a Montessori distance learning program look like that really served our children and our families. Because I was doing some work for admissions, so I was actually speaking to a lot of families outside of the Guidepost network who, once distance learning was starting for them at public schools and private schools across the country, as the weeks went on, they were reporting that the distance learning they were experiencing was really not working for their children. And so some of you might have experienced this yourselves or heard about this from friends, that they were experiencing certain components of distance learning that they were finding problematic. So I was hearing from parents outside of the Guidepost network, for instance, that they were getting, thick packages of worksheets that their children were really struggling with, that they weren't finding them interesting, and then that was resulting in battles between parent and child to get these worksheets finished. Or parents were finding that their children were feeling very isolated, having distance learning at home. Or parents who were kind of seeing for the first time that maybe the pacing of the program wasn't right for their child, that maybe their child hadn't grasped a certain skill or concept, but the group was sort of moving on and they didn't know what to do because they didn't feel like their child was ready to move on to the next step. So we were hearing a lot of what was not working for families across the country, and we're really inspired to look at our program and to say, well, how can we construct distance learning in a way that's really going to serve our families? And probably unsurprisingly, what we arrived at is that the most important thing was to really be true to the Montessori principles that we knew served children. That the fact that we're now operating at a distance didn't change the fundamentals about how children learn and what elementary children need to thrive. So we came up with sort of 4 pillars or 4 principles for our distance learning program. And the very first one was to continue to present engaging learning the Montessori way. So I know some of you are new to Montessori, and so you might not know what that means. What does it mean to have engaging learning the Montessori way? So I can just call out a few features of what that means. So first and foremost, it means meeting the child where they are and providing the right level of challenge for that child. And so the way that we've done that in our distance learning program, as with brick and mortar classrooms, is to make sure that when we are presenting lessons to children, that we're doing so in small ability-based groups. And so that way we ensure that what we're presenting is at the right level of challenge for that child, because there's nothing more demotivating than having information presented to you that is either much too easy for you or is way beyond your current context of knowledge and your current skill level, and so you can't follow along. So we make sure to group children in multi-aged, small, ability-based lesson groups so that we're hitting the right level of challenge for them. And then we individualize their follow-up work so that, again, it is right for each child. Another aspect of having engaging learning the Montessori way is the way that we present our lessons. So within Montessori Elementary, we present lessons in a very story-like format. And so this is not actually just in literature or in history, but really across the subject areas. We tell stories, whether it's in math or in geometry or in grammar. I actually heard a grammar lesson presentation recently in one of our classrooms where a guide, which is what we call our teachers, was presenting the story of the pronoun, and was telling the story of how it's sort of like the noun is like a king and the pronoun is like a prince, and the pronoun was trying to usurp the position of the king, and every time the king would say a noun, the pronoun would jump in and replace it with a pronoun, and the children were just riveted. And so we find that by presenting our lessons in story-like format, it's engaging for the child, it gives a holistic picture of the concept we're introducing, and it's really memorable. So that's another aspect of Montessori Elementary that works very, very well at a distance. Another critical component for us at a distance and in person in Montessori is to offer choice. There is nothing as motivating for children, and for adults for that matter, as having choice in your learning. So it might be that we presented a certain concept and a child has a choice about which aspect of that concept to dive deeply into. It might be that a child has a choice how to present their learning. Maybe they want to do a poster, or maybe they want to do a presentation, or they have different ways that they want to show their learning. But it is really critical that we give children the freedom to have choices within their education and to really go deeply into areas that are interesting for them. So my own 9-year-old son is in one of our Montessori virtual learning classrooms, and they recently were learning writing skills, and they were learning how to do research projects. And he, like many 9-year-olds, is completely obsessed with Lego. And so the guide gave him, he talked with the guide and came up with, he wanted to do his research project into the history of Lego. And so it's a perfect example of where you can have a skill and give children space to do a passion project, and that having really an immense impact on their motivation. So we have the right level of challenge, we have the story-like format, and we have plenty of choice for children. One last thing I would say about engagement the Montessori way is the importance for us in going from the concrete to the abstract. That if you want a child to really understand things in a first-handed way, they do need to have exposure to concretes that they can see and touch and manipulate and explore, so that they really understand the abstraction that that's built upon. And so I'm expecting lots of questions in the question period about how we do that at a distance, and especially in areas like math and geometry. But that's where we've had to get creative, where Rivka is going to be talking a lot about our altitude learning platform, which is a tool that enables us to keep true to this principle of going from the concrete to the abstract. So our first big pillar is to continue to provide engaging learning the Montessori way. The second one is community. Montessori as a pedagogy is based on meeting the developmental needs of the child at their particular stage of development. And one of the things that those of you who teach elementary age students, or maybe are the parent of an elementary age child, one of the characteristics that you are probably very aware of is that elementary children are intensely social. That they thrive on having opportunities to interact with their peers and to collaborate with their peers. So that is one of the pillars of our program at a distance, is to make sure that we still provide those opportunities for our students. And so we start and end each day with community gatherings where children can get together and have a little time to interact. Very importantly, where they can share their work. That's, again, a huge motivator, having a chance to share your projects and your work with your friends. We, over Zoom, will construct breakout rooms where we can have collaboration spaces. So 2 or 3 children can get together and work on a project together, that they have a time to do that. We continue to do birthday celebrations and other rituals as a group over Zoom. And we also continue to do class meetings over Zoom. In elementary class meetings, we will often come up with some kind of a challenge or a problem we're having as a group. So I know that in one of our virtual classrooms, there was an issue with children being very busy in the chat and distracting each other in the chat. And so they had a class meeting about, hey, this is going on. What do you think is causing this? And what are some things that we can do to problem solve this? What do you think one of our new community norms should be? And the children had a chance to problem solve that in their community meeting. So we recognize that this need for social interaction is real for elementary children, and that it's important for the distance learning program to make room for that. And I would add that the need for community is really important for parents as well. A lot of parents are supporting their children in a brand new way from home for the first time. And so I think that for a distance learning program to be successful, we need to partner with parents more than ever before. So having room for Zoom office hours with parents, making time for one-on-one meetings with parents over Zoom, sending home weekly highlights of what the children are doing. We've really taken seriously the need to support our parents, because this is brand new for all of us. In addition to community, we have found that something that's been really important for our learners is routine and structure. So we have really encouraged families on weekdays to get up at their usual time in the mornings. To, as tempting as it is to stay in those PJs for all of us, we definitely recommend getting dressed in kind of school clothes, having breakfast, and just keeping that structure to the day, because that really signals to the child that this is a day to learn. as opposed to, we're off on holiday or it's a weekend. That this is a school day, it is a day to learn. And we found that helped to really sort of set the context for the children for the day. And so we really do encourage having that structure and having a daily flow, but allowing for flexibility within that structure. So we really believe in having extended work periods, even at a distance. So when a child is not in a small group lesson, they do have an extended period of time where they can really dive into their work and really experience deep learning. So we do not recommend sort of slicing and dicing the day into very small segments, because that can be a barrier to children engaging in what we call big work. And the last pillar I wanted to just mention, the one at the bottom there, is authentic student accountability. I definitely heard from families outside of Guidepost Network who were sort of distraught because they found that as soon as their children learned that their distance learning work was not being graded, that the marks didn't sort of count for the report card, especially with older elementary and middle school children, then they started saying, well, why would I do the work, right? It doesn't count for my grade, so why would I do it? And so fortunately, that's not a problem that we have within our Montessori program, because we don't use those kind of grades to sort of motivate children. What we try to establish is a really authentic accountability for student work. And so Rivka is going to speak a little bit just about the feedback loop and how students can submit work through our Altitude Learning platform so the guide can see it. But some of the tools that we use are things like work journals. So for the child to have a notebook where they can record what they're learning, what they're working on, the kind of work that they're doing, often with times, so that they can have a record of when they started and finished their work. And then to be able to take that work journal into regular coaching sessions with their guide, with their teacher. That can either be one-on-one, or sometimes it's in a small group over Zoom. And to have conversations around, what were your goals for this week? And let's have a look at how your progress is going toward those goals. Oh, you had some challenges, some stumbling blocks. What happened? Let's talk about how we can brainstorm solving those. And so these are skills that are built up over time. But what you have as a result of these ongoing coaching sessions and reflections on work journals and on finished work is you have a child who's developing the ability to reflect on their learning, the ability to take ownership over their time management and their priorities, and really taking ownership over their learning as a whole. And we have found that using those tools, the work journal and the coaching sessions with the guide, that builds really an authentic accountability that's coming from within the child. That's not needing to come from the adult in the learning environment. So those really are the pillars of our distance learning program, really with the takeaway being that what we are doing is using the technology we have to fit our Montessori principles and making sure that we're not abandoning the principles only because our learning environment has changed. And so what I'm going to do now is hand it over to Rivka so she can give you really a view of what exactly the day looks like and really dive into the learning platform that has really enabled us to share our Montessori lessons at a distance.
Kelly, are you able to see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I just want to, start off by reflecting on a few points that that Lindsay was making, especially about the routine and structure piece. One of the beautiful things about using a learning platform like Altitude Learning is that, first of all, everything that becomes complicated about children being independent in the process of joining a class in the morning, getting online and being part of Zoom, knowing when to be responsible for what on that schedule, knowing when will be blocks of time that will be small group meetings versus what are the times that would be open times for choice or follow-up work. All of these things can then be sort of rooted in one place, And so typically at the beginning of a morning, a child joining our distance learning class would first log on to Altitude and would immediately open a schedule card, something like this, in which the link is already provided, and the child would click on morning meeting and immediately would take them to the Zoom room without having to go to 2 separate apps. And once the Zoom room is open, the schedule card provides an opportunity for the guide and all of the children who are aboard for that morning meeting to go over what will be happening today. And then provide the structure that throughout the course of a day, a child is kind of clicking through this daily schedule and also making choices from what's called the playlist that I'm going to show you in a minute. And then getting to the end of the day, having a closing meeting and being able to reflect on, hey, what happened today and what lessons would I love to see more of? What do I wish might be different? And having like a little bit of a reflection piece at the end of each day to plan for new things that might be optimized for the next day. So that schedule card is the way that we're sort of, keeping a backbone going with the class. And as you can tell, the small group lessons that Lindsay described of being differentiated for, different groups who need different types of lessons, while the other children are maybe going in a breakout room with an assistant guide or working collaboratively on cards or activities that have been assigned after a group lesson, is going on throughout the day. There are opportunities for sharing and reflection twice a day, at the beginning of the morning and at the end of the day. There are times in which guides are giving those directed lessons, and then there are more open times like lunch and movement times, where this particular block is here, and maybe children might be going off Zoom and then joining again for the afternoon. So part of the goal here is not to have a schedule where children are literally on Zoom 100% of the time necessarily, but can be on Zoom if they need to be. So the idea is to have that sort of sharing routine where guides are truly guiding the children, but they're becoming very independent about their learning. They know exactly what to expect, and they now can kind of navigate that on their own. So that schedule card is just one piece of what's called a playlist, or a work, like a work schedule for the day. And typically what would happen is a child, after logging into Zoom, would be going over this work plan board with the group, and also independently, and perhaps even creating a piece of paper in their work journal that they are copying down what kinds of work commitments they'd like to make for that day. And what's beautiful about the way Altitude handles a playlist is that it's very self-defined. It could be that there is a column that the child names schedule, and then there are today's lessons and maybe choice work that I might do when I have open work cycle. And there may be ongoing projects I'm working on, and maybe this week's lessons happen to be lessons that are going to happen throughout the week, but not today. And perhaps I even have some cards that I'm going to use as a save card. Maybe this would be a reflection I might do at the end of the week when I'm getting ready to have one of those conferences that Lindsay described. And I want to this card would sort of prompt me to think through what I'd like to do in preparation for that conference. So all of these columns start off when a child joins a distance learning class by being a little bit more defined by the guide, but the goal is that this should be like almost like a day planner, and that eventually the children come to the rhythm of understanding how to organize cards and activities in a way that will speak to them. So in my example, my schedule card that I was showing is here. Let's say, for example, today's lessons happen to be that I'm going to go to a lesson with a small group on homographs. And I'm also going to do a small group lesson on combining two angles. And I'm even going to do a review of cursive with linking over stroke letters. So it could be that these three cards are, in my assigned column, and I've now dragged them over because I'm planning my day, and my guide has gone over with me in morning meeting the fact that these three lessons will be these little mini lessons that I'll need to attend for the day. So I am dragging these cards over. And it could be that I also have in this assigned column some other things that the guide is now making available to me. For example, remember how we learned about asking questions last week with research? One of the things you might have open as a choice is to use what we learned about asking questions to do 2 or 3 sort of pre-research activities on our own based on our own interests. It could be that I'm also putting this elementary showcase here because I want to gather some of the evidence from my playlist to share out with parents on an online event that we're doing once every 2 weeks, where the children are all getting a chance to share different things that they've collected about their work. So each of these different cards represent a different little mini chunk of learning, whether that be attend a lesson or attend a lesson and do a follow-up. And I'm organizing my cards in a way that gives me both that choice and agency that we were talking about, and also these cards will have the accountability piece. So I'm going to show you the cycle of what happens when a child actually chooses a lesson. So for example, maybe I went to the lesson on combining two angles, and that happened to be a small group lesson I did this morning. This card represents my going to the lesson, which in this case happens to be a video that's embedded in this card. However, usually in distance learning with an actual physical guide, we don't have a video that's embedded. However, this card happens to be one that we use for our Guidepost Elementary album. So it does actually have a video of a lesson being given by a guide. And I finished the lesson, and now it's time for me to do my follow-up work. So I may be doing it right there, right after the lesson. I may be closing out of this card and saving it for a little later in the day when I have an open work cycle. And I'm going to first start by recording the pairs of angles in my journal. And this card even gives me an example of what that might look like. And I think it's really important, especially for children who have not yet learned how to use a work journal, to have a lot of good exemplars of what it might look like, just to get started with that. Then I might capture a picture of my journal below, which means that in the student work area of the card, I can actually embed either a photograph, a screen, or a screenshot, or I could even have a narrated video of up to 5 minutes that I embed in this card, where maybe I'm going to choose, instead of putting my journal picture, to actually describe the different types of angles myself and embed it in the card. And when I finish doing all the work that has been listed in the steps, I will then go ahead and turn in this card. And at the point in which I turn it in, it's going to say, hey, would you like to do some next steps on this particular topic you just learned? And at this point, the card now goes from simply a way to show that I have understood what the lesson with my guide was about, to my getting to choose follow-ups that are completely up to me and in my own time. And I could continue working on combining two angles the rest of the week, and maybe even next week, based on what's offered in the Altitude platform. So think of next steps as like choose your own adventure, which I think is really exciting for children in terms of their motivation for exploring something they've already heard about, but also gives them a chance to fill their day with things that are more than just completely directed lessons that they now have to do when an adult is giving over the lesson. So when I see the next steps, I can say, hey, would I like to do some angle practice, or would I like to quiz myself? And when I decide which one of these I've chosen, it will now, if I choose angle tasks, pop into my playlist over here in the assigned, and I will drag it on to where I want it to be. So all of the cards that we have included, or that the guide has now assigned in the playlist, have that same similar structure. So for example, if I'm doing homographs, I might end up doing a series of tasks right after the lesson, and then there may be some next steps. And the next steps might also have next steps. So there's a chance that a child can go down an entire pathway of learning just from one particular card. You'll also see that there are cards on all kinds of topics. In a few minutes, I'm going to show you some exemplars of student work. So there are not just children working on the typical language, math, cultural subjects that you might find in school, but we also are trying to give them some other options like art appreciation, music appreciation, STEM challenges, other kinds of things. And that's also included in sort of that importance of community and collaboration, that some of those kinds of bigger picture projects are wonderful for getting children who are definitely in an online environment excited and moving with that. Now, I just want to show you two other features of Altitude that are really super helpful, I think, to children. The first one is that children can create a portfolio of the work that they have been doing in their online class. Happens to be in this impersonated version of me, I haven't yet created a portfolio. But what's wonderful about creating one is that I can start creating sections of cards and my personal work that I would like to caption and save for later. And this portfolio then becomes an amazing reflection tool. When I go to conferencing on a weekly basis, let's say on Fridays, and I'm looking through my playlist with my guide, or when I want to get online on Zoom with other children and share some of my ideas, as a wonderful way of also sort of piquing their interest and getting them to, potentially choose those cards and do some of the ideas that I've come up with. So the portfolio thing is wonderful, again, for building that accountability piece and that piece of my personal choice and ownership and learning. And then the second component of that is what's called Stream. And Stream is a great way that you as a parent who may have a child participating in a distance learning class get updates on how your child's learning is doing. And the children can actually share out cards and work on Stream, and the guides can as well. So those two components kind of provide that full cycle of my turning in a card with learning evidence, getting a feedback from the guide, who then sends that card back to me with narrative feedback, more prompts and questions, potentially even reminding me that perhaps in that fraction work, like I might not have solved it the way we thought it was going to be, and should I give a demonstration, or should we meet tomorrow in a small group lesson? And these cards that are being turned in and then sent back are really important for that cycle, as well as the gathering the evidence and sharing it out so parents can also understand what's happening with their child's learning. So that piece of the altitude playlist is this is kind of this part of the demonstration, but I would love if Kelly would actually pull up some slides that will show examples of student work that was actually turned in for these cards, and kind of the wide range of the types of learning that has been made possible through the creativity of amazing Montessorians, and also just where children have then taken the learning, which is even more exciting for us. We actually have meetings internally sometimes where we go through and look at children's work that they've turned in, and I feel like we always think it's like our birthday whenever we see some of the exciting, beautiful things that children have thought up. I'm starting off with just showing a quick slide of a wide range of language activities. We have children who are all the way from, first years who are 6 years old on these types of learning. It's amazing to imagine that, right? 6-year-olds getting online and being a part of a distance learning class, all the way through children who are all the way upwards of 5th and 6th years. And that wide range might include anything from emerging phonics and spelling. In fact, this morning when I was looking at different evidence to put into this presentation, I found a few videos of children who were telling over their spelling aloud, and that was their learning evidence that they had submitted for phonics cards. Literature circles, being involved collaboratively in small groups and breakout sessions on Zoom where children are actually taking apart a book, having a book discussion, writing based on the stories that they're reading, creating thematic projects, getting excited about the idea of sort of being their own authors. There are several children that I saw so far in this spring who had basically taken a Google Doc that was embedded in a card and had started a book of poetry and had been writing their own poetry throughout the course of 3 months and adding pages to it, and almost created an anthology of like their own writing that I imagine will probably continue once the summer session starts. We put a lot of emphasis on the nuts and bolts of research and learning how to research all the way down to the very first baby step, which is observing, like observation, and how you know what kind of question you would want to ask. So we have quite a lot of activity that goes on around that. Parts of speech, grammar, mechanics, word study, sentence analysis, knowing about the English language, how to be a great sentence writer, how to be a great writer because you understand the mechanics of language. All of these examples that are shown here are anything from children diagramming sentences using our Montessori grammar symbols, to children writing their own stories, children journaling, children labeling objects in their home with little labels. In this case, it was a noun gallery that had even a baby that had like the word baby on the label. and all the way into using some other technology, like for example, Padlet, and learning how to use Padlet for a practical purpose, for how to create lists or making a media gallery. So Kelly, just switch to the second one, if you will. Math has been a particularly exciting place for us to go as Montessorians. There has been that challenge of saying, how much could a person really have of like actual physical Montessori materials in their home? Most of us don't. So there have been some very creative workarounds, anything from actually constructing our own simplistic version of something to be able to manipulate and see the conceptual piece of that material, all the way to creating digital versions, which we have done in a sort of crowdsourced fashion, getting people who are just app developers to start becoming resident Montessorians, and learning how to create these manipulatives that can be done online in an applet fashion, and then being able to demonstrate those over to the children in a small group lesson and say, okay, now that you've learned how to exchange, let's say, with digital manipulatives, I would like you to go to that digital site and manipulate some things, and also take screen captures or upload video that shows that you understand how that works. So the creativity has been flowing on that. I think the other thing is knowing that you can teach things like multiples and fractions by using your own kitchen and materials that you have in your own home. I mean, one of the best ways of working with fractions and measurement is cooking, sewing, doing things that are like practical, fun things that you have in your home, or by gathering small objects and using those objects for counting and adding and operations work. So wherever possible, we've tried to cut out that need for necessarily having the same materials we have in the classroom. And that's kind of forced us to appreciate even more the conceptual framework that these materials offer, and how important it is to find that workaround. So here's some examples of children doing fraction charts, finding practical fractions in their home. Here's a digital version of what we call the stamp game, which is one of those early decimal operations activities. Here's a digital version of our fraction insets and our golden bead materials. Here's some journal work that children did with area and angles and geometry. And here's a paper with multiples, different circles representing multiples. So here's an example of some of the children's work we did across the spectrum with math. Kelly, you want to switch? And about the cultural subjects. So we started off doing a lot of things that were sort of botany heavy back in March and April, and I think we were all very inspired by the same gardening bug that many people in America are going through right now in our small environment. So we started off creating a series of big lessons, the great lessons, and the guides were really creative about how to tell those big stories that we usually use really interesting charts and materials in the classroom. It's almost like a show don't tell version of inspiring children on those big picture contexts that Lindsay was describing with storytelling. So we came up with a lot of ways that we could recreate that using Zoom meetings, using digital charts. Some of the Montessori supply companies even, or organizations, actually made their things available for free now so that people will be able to learn online with them, which is pretty exciting. So some of the things you see in these pictures of student work is a plant story that a boy created with cartoons after he learned about the story of plants. Some of the follow-up activities that we did about the sort of story of the universe and all the different basic principles about physical science. Up on the top right, it's a research project someone did about chipmunks. We also have a cute little paper trilobite that somebody built on the bottom right side after learning about the timeline of life. And then we have things like classification, which is an important step in the idea of before we go into zoology, for example, or botany, and just getting children to get objects in their home and classify them in different ways, or be creative about creating maps of our own home, or maps of our neighborhood, or maps of our body on paper so that we could start learning about maps. So all of these things, again, sort of draw on that fact that everyday life has so many opportunities to explore these different areas, and that by fitting them within those big contextual stories that the guides are constantly cultivating in the children, then we are able to make available these various fun activities that kids are going to want to choose and do over and over. And then there's one last slide, I think. And here's some exciting children's work that we've had just in expressions and labs. That's just kind of what I decided to call it for this. For example, art appreciation or music appreciation, or children taking something that they did in geometry and then breaking off and doing interesting follow-ups that have to do with art. Children hearing some of those great lesson stories and then being inspired to draw their own, to create their own drawings. Or here was an example of someone who created his own compass rose, his own creative compass rose from scratch. There's also an example of a child who did scratch coding, and that was one of the ways that he actually turned in his story of music. He created a scratch coding about a song that he designed, and this particular character dances out according to the music. And then the top right, here's an example of a child creating molecules out of things that you can find in your own home. I know that this week I created an activity that was on area, and it was using area with Triscuits or Cheez-Its. So I think there's so many fun ways that children in their homes can still get that Montessori original lesson that helps them understand, like I said, conceptually what an activity is about, but then get really hands-on and be able to use the things that are around them in their home. And here's a lot of great examples from things that children have done.
I think that might be one of our guides in our distance learning classes.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say that this was Kacee, and this was one of the examples that she wanted to show. And I think what's really especially beautiful about this picture is, first of all, it really is capturing a moment in which this boy is getting an opportunity to share over a chart that he's created that has all the people in his family. I think that's what it was like a kind of a relationship chart. And you see how everybody else who's sort of there in the background, including examples of where you have pictures of family members nearby and like real world scenarios that are going on behind people on cameras, making it feel as if everyone is really part of this like beautiful community, intimate community, even though they may be very far away. And our attitude has definitely been that Zoom itself as a vehicle is a tool that we're utilizing to do what we believe works really well with young children. And the working well with young children includes those 4 important pillars: the routine and structure piece, the community piece, the following the Montessori way of thinking on how different activities unfold, and also having that accountability piece that here's a boy actually completing his work and getting opportunities to share back, and that then inspiring other children to choose to do that, or to captivate them with ideas that only comes from when you have that really built into your system, into your learning system.
Are we ready for questions?
Absolutely.
Okay. Don asks, with this schedule, I think this goes back to when we were sharing earlier about how the day works. When do children get to meet one-on-one with the guide? Right now, our one-on-one meetings are scheduled 2 times a week in the afternoons, which doesn't allow for open Zooms or lessons during those times.
I mean, I can hop in. Different guides handle this different ways, but it sounds like some of our guides do it a similar way, where a lot of the lessons are happening in the mornings, and then in the afternoons they're alternating days between when they are having the one-on-one and small group meetings with the children, and days where they're also giving lessons in the afternoon. So I think the principle really is meeting the needs of the children. What we also found very quickly was that some of our younger children who were newer to working independently really needed those one-on-ones every day. And some of our older children they were just running with it and they were very independent, only needed those meetings maybe once a week. And so we found by balancing what was happening in the afternoon and really being responsive to the children's needs, that was really the key to making it work.
Pallavi asked, what about supplies? Is there a list that kids are given when they register?
Yeah, as we went very quickly in March we had different ways that we were doing it. We were making packages that parents came and picked up, and we were mailing some things to families, and we were sort of doing it very kind of week by week. But actually, for our distance learning classrooms, as we're planning for fall, that's exactly what we're doing. We're going to be sending kits out to families that either we'll see the cadence on a monthly basis or a bi-monthly basis that do have the supplies that families are going to need for the learning experience, so that we make sure that all the children do have what they need. So that is going to be the approach that we're taking.
Lisa asked, are the lesson or task cards created by the guide, or are they preset?
We definitely have a whole team of people who are very passionate about creating online curricula. And so we start off with a library of just about anything we can imagine would be in the sort of traditional Montessori scope and sequence, with a lot of suggested follow-ups. But our hope is that guides really use those as just a starting point. They might pull them out of the library and adopt them for assigning with their own students in their distance learning class. But oftentimes it means that the guide will then tweak them for those children's actual interest, or like I said, some of the cards may have embedded video that the guide knows, no, I would like to give that lesson. I don't want them to watch it on a video. So they will sort of adjust those cards and then assign them to the children, and they'll sort of become part of that classroom's library.
And Kelly, if I can piggyback on that, in addition to, as Rivka said, the guides being able to copy over and tweak those cards, the guides can of course make their own cards as well. But what's interesting too is the children can also make their own cards. So my daughter just finished upper elementary in one of our virtual classrooms. And when I looked through her playlist, I would point out like, oh, that's an interesting card. And she would say, thanks, I made that one. So often there's a blank card where a child can decide what is it that they want to pursue. And they're sort of designing the learning experience themselves, which is pretty neat.
That's really cool. Vanessa said, to turn in their work, am I right in assuming that they would need to ask a parent to take a picture with their phone? Our 6-year-old doesn't have a tablet.
It could be that most of the children are using the camera that's embedded on a laptop or a computer, a desktop computer, and they're just using the take a picture function that's on that computer. And we would definitely recommend that that's the best way to make it that your child's independent. If you have to do a workaround because your device doesn't have the camera, doing a cell phone picture is super fast. You could just snap it and then the child can do the turning in piece.
Layla asked, where is the concrete part? Like doing the Homophone Towers with movement, not just writing down words.
So I would say that that's why we felt that it was so important from the beginning as an organization to have people who were on the curriculum design team who could come up with a lot of exemplars of examples where children are not just either watching passively a lesson on a screen, not just necessarily making a journal entry only, but also prompting the child to creatively design sort of activities that would mirror or try to recreate a little bit of that movement piece, but would also require some innovation and ingenuity on the side of the child. So in some ways, that's prompted us to even think beyond what a child might necessarily just take from a shelf as a 4th year, for example, and also kind of prompt that 4th year to actually imagine like, well, how could I represent in 3-dimensional space something I could manipulate to do this? And we've actually partnered a bit with children who've come up with some creative ideas on that. So I think once Montessori guides then kind of get that because they see some of those ideas and exemplars, their creativity sort of like flows from it. So we definitely agree that that is something that needs to be protected. It can't simply be a frontal lesson that you now journal. We have to continue that integrity of having the children construct.
Christina asked, is there anything that you do differently for lower elementary children, especially rising 1st years at the beginning?
Well, the principle is the same as the classroom in the sense that you have to meet the child where they are in terms of what they're capable of doing independently. And we've definitely found that with our 5.5, 6, 6.5-year-olds, that they do need a lot more scaffolding. I mean, just simple things with, you know, clicking on a link to get into Zoom or whatever the child is being asked of. we have found that we need to provide the scaffolding that sort of meets that child where they are. Rivka, I don't know if you have more to say on it, but it is definitely a need. 5.5, a 6.5-year-old is not going to function with the same independence at the beginning that an older child may be able to do.
I think we are very committed, though, to trying to very much support and be aligned with the actual families who are there in a physical sense around that child, and making sure that the home environment is set up for success. And that when there may be key moments when children are learning some new thing that they've not done before, making it really clear to parents up front, when are those times, those rare times that we're going to need you, and here's the way that we can partner together. And I think that's another key element of making successful online learning, is that the guide is truly interested in partnering with the parents, because we understand that the parents are equally there as the support to making this thing successful. So, and not overburdening, but making sure that it's just very clear when we need it and what are the expectations. And I think families have really enjoyed that piece of it.
Speaking of the physical environment, Mary asked, if you have two children who are very close in age, about 18 months apart, do you suggest building out your days of learning to incorporate them together? Would they be set up in the same room with different stations they can each do activities at? For example, each have their own desk and workspace, or share the same table?
I have my thoughts. I don't know if you want me to. I have found that even when children are close in age, and there certainly are going to be some projects that are beautiful for them to do together, that they are individuals, and they are going to have their own interests and their own current skill levels. So we have found the most success with the children having their own devices, being able to have their own playlists, and being able to have their kind of quiet work time when they need it. But also the fact that Montessori is always in multi-age groupings means that there are just a plethora of activities and projects and practical life around the home that is really beautiful for them to get together. So I think having the flexibility of, my children are actually 3 years apart, and they were still able to do quite a few activities together, but very much also appreciated being able to have their own day that they're constructing and their own lessons. So that would be my recommendation, Rivka. I don't know if you found the same.
Totally agree with you.
I've had several questions about, is this platform available for other schools? And I'm actually going to be sending out an email after the webinar with information about our school partnerships team if you are interested in this for your classroom or school. But yes, the answer is yes. Okay, Dawn asked, will you all be going in and out of distance learning this year, or will you be continuing through the year in the distance?
That's a great question. For our brick and mortar schools, we're going to be responsive to the needs of the local community. So certainly if there is health and safety guidance that recommends that schools close again, we would be responsive to that, and we would do a shift to distance learning for those classrooms for the time that it's required. But in addition to that, we are opening in all the different time zones across the states, we are opening purely virtual learning classrooms. And so these are for families who maybe were previously homeschooling, or maybe don't live near a Montessori school but have always wanted Montessori, that this is an opportunity for them to have access. And it's also an opportunity for families who, for health considerations or other reasons, are maybe not comfortable going back in person for the next year or so that they have opportunities just purely to have virtual learning for the year. So we're offering both.
Catherine asked, or said and asked, it's hard to tell from the daily schedule how many hours children are in front of the computer each day. Do you have an average time in front of the screen?
I would say that it's very responsive, meaning there are times in which for morning meeting, for afternoon reflection, and for small group lessons that are really important to have those touch bases. But then there is also the need of the child and how much scaffolding a child might need to get through the different activities and follow-ups and at least learn the system of how to do so. So some of your older children, you will see them log off as soon as their morning lessons are over, and they're off the computer doing their own activities, following through. Maybe they've even written out their schedule on paper and they're primarily doing their activities off the computer. There also may be children who throughout the course of the morning need to keep touching base with the guides and gaining clarification. So there are two typical ways that a child can do that. One, the guides stay on all day and are available so that regardless of whether a child wants to be on or off, the guides are there for them. But there is also the possibility through altitude for a child to ask questions through the card that gets pinged immediately to the guide, and the guide can write the child back. So even the child doesn't need to necessarily get onto Zoom to sort of get clarification about how to continue doing an activity. The goal of the cards themselves is not to be very heavy on having to stay on a computer. It's not like you're clicking on a link to, you know, an app where you have to work 30 minutes on something because the card told you to. The card is primarily there to direct what to do next and to kind of keep that cycle of turning things in and getting feedback and knowing what is available to do for learning. So they're not there in order to try to keep kids online. Kind of balance depending on what a particular child needs.
I had a couple of questions about how many children are in a typical small group lesson.
That really varies depending on the age of the child and the subject. I found that math lessons tend to be smaller. So you'll sometimes have a math lesson that only has 2 or 3 children in it. A literature circle discussion might have 4 to 6 children in it. So it really does range. And then depending on the age of the child as well. But I think it's fair to say that a typical range for a small group lesson is somewhere between 2 and maybe 6 or 7 is what I've seen typically. Rivka, have you found same?
Yeah.
Stephen asked, how are you assuring equal access if a child does not have a device or internet?
Well, the students that have signed up at our schools, at our programs, we were actually loaning them devices if they had those needs. We had actually predicted it was going to be higher than it actually was. We were surprised by how many children actually did have access, but that was something that was kind of built into our program, that we were loaning devices out. Now I know that that's much, much more difficult for families that are in, you know, large public districts that have much, much higher need. But we were fortunately able to provide that for our families.
I would also say that there are some pretty affordable, around $120 Chromebooks these days that work really well with this type of system, and also have a lot of ability for parents to control what can be accessible from that computer. So, you know, anything that really just does a very basic job of being able to get online and be able to take a picture, which is about the $120 to $150 Chromebook, could be a good option, just not to have to, you know, afford a very expensive tablet. It's not needed.
Sure. Luann asked, for the independent work times for younger children, for example, 7 years old, will the guides be available to help them if they have questions, or will this be the parent's responsibility?
The guides, typically what I have seen is that when the lead guide is in the small group lessons, the assistant guide is making herself available to answer those questions. And as Rivka mentioned, it happens in a variety of ways. Sometimes children are sending them through the platform, but sometimes we have it's almost like an open study hall where it's sort of quiet and a child can be there working and they have a question, they sort of kind of poke their hand up and they can ask that question. And just for security, we found that especially some of the younger ones really like that. So we do typically have someone available, but I think it's also important to have reasonable expectations, especially when a child is new to distance learning. They are going to have questions they go to mom and dad for. You know, we are going to do everything we can to scaffold their learning and to be there to support them. But I think especially in the early weeks, they're going to come to mom and dad with questions, and they're going to need a little bit of guidance about how to do things. And we just ask that if a child is coming to their parent with questions that show confusion or show that something's not hitting the mark with their work, that we want to hear from that parent so that we can redesign the child's learning experience to make sure that we're meeting their needs. So I would say that for the most part, we should be ready and available to answer children's questions, but that depending on the age and the independence level of the child, they are going to have some for their parents as well.
Yeah.
A couple of questions. Do we offer this for the 3 to 6 level?
We have offered a variety of different programs for 3 to 6. So, and I know, Kelly, you're going to be sharing that information. So of course it has to look very different depending on the age of the child. So what it has looked like for our younger primary students, so the 3-4-year-olds, has been virtual circle times where they can sing songs and have music and movement. They have had small group lessons, a lot of them around practical life and sort of early sensorial and math lessons. And then we are also going to be offering for older children, closer to 5-year-olds, a half-day kindergarten option. So that's something in the links that Kelly's going to send out that will be available as well.
Well, gosh, it's already been an hour. I feel like we still have so many questions left to answer, but I will be sending out a follow-up email, and there'll be, you can reply to that email if we weren't able to get to your question today. But thank you so much, Lindsay and Rivka, for sharing. And any final parting words?
I think we've covered it all. I hope that you enjoyed sort of seeing the platform that we're using and also seeing what's really inspired us, which is to make sure that we are using the tools available to fit into the principles that we hold near and dear and not feeling like we have to abandon our principles. Our environments have changed. So that's what's inspiring us and moving us forward.
Yes. Definitely. Well, thank you, everyone. Again, the recording will be posted in the next day or so on the Guidepost Montessori YouTube channel, so you can share it with friends if you'd like, and I'll be in touch by email. All right. Bye.